absolutely fucking sure of himself as he says stupid things. You know, that comparing statisticians who are some of the cleverest people you're ever going to meet to Trump supporters because they can't be reasoned with. It's just like, have you got any self-awareness at all, mate? Absolutely none.
There's no comparison. It's just, you told me to look up, what's his face, the guy, the doctor. You told me to look up Dr. Jayam.
Oh, yeah.
Really, just watch him speak. He's a very unlikable person, and I didn't do that because I don't want that to colour my perception of things that are being said. But I have listened to Timmy Evans on a couple of podcasts, just like him being interviewed, him being questioned about some of the evidence that he gave, evidence in inverted commas. And he's just so bullish, and he gets really, really angry when somebody
challenges him.
A reasonable point to him that he doesn't have an answer for. He just gets really, really raging about it.
It's really interesting as well. So I hadn't realised, because I've been listening to the John Sweeney podcast, but actually if you go on YouTube, there's video footage of the interview that he did with Dowie Evans. And watching, I'm not a big believer in all the body language stuff, do you know what I mean? Some of it can be useful. I'm sure sometimes you can see when someone's awkward or fidgeting or nervous if it doesn't tell you why. But his body language is on this occasion incredibly interesting, because when he puts to him the stuff about Harry Clark, who was Sally Clark's son that died, child. So Sally Clark was the barrister that was committed she was found guilty of murdering her 2 children who had died of cot death. And the second one, I believe, was Harry Clark, and she was put away on the statistics where they just multiplied the chance of one cot death by 2 cot deaths. So, and that gave you some ridiculous figure of like 73 million or something silly like that. And actually, the review of Harry's case revealed that he had Streptococcus bacteria in his spinal fluid, and so although he hadn't gone to a stage where he had full sepsis, that had been nonetheless enough to kill him. And that's often the case with small babies, is that they don't get to the point of full sepsis. If they're weak for some reason, then it can be enough that they have an infection and it might not show up everywhere in all the normal ways you screen. So John Sweeney puts that to Dowie Evans and says, sometimes babies don't show sepsis, but they might have an infection anyway. And he's sort of tut-tutting that, and he says, well, that's what happened with Harry Clark. And he says, who's Harry Clark? And he says, well, Sally Clark's child. And you see the look on his face as this clangs with him, because everybody in this fucking, expert witness regime knows who Sally Clark is. And you can see it dawning on him that there's something that he didn't know about it. It's so obvious in that moment that he's realising that you can see it dawning on him. It's horrific to watch it. I've watched the same clip about 10 times and it just makes me shudder, because I'm thinking, that's you realising. And rather than admit that you might have made a mistake, you're now fucking digging in, even though there's no argument. You're realising that there's something that you didn't know. And you're one of these guys that if you don't know something, it doesn't exist. It just doesn't occur to you that there might be something that you don't know because you fucking think you know everything. And he's subsequent to this, after saying that statistics have nothing to do with it, he's now produced his own statistical analysis that proves Lucy Letby is guilty, obviously. But and all the statisticians who have been complaining about the whole thing are going, no. But he's had a moment of realisation, and then he's turned his back on that. So,
well, I mean, he's now, I think he's been quite annoyed by people challenging him specifically on this, and saying that it was his job. This is just his opinion. It was the defence's job to mount a counter argument with an expert witness of comparable credibility to him, which obviously didn't happen. They heard just his evidence, and one of the guy who's been writing the column for Private Eye about Lucy Letby, I heard him on the John Sweeney podcast saying that this is just going to be a repetition of the Sean Sweeney podcast. But I think it was a good point that he raised, that why do we have expert witnesses for the prosecution and for the defence? Surely it should be a multidisciplinary panel or the case, rather than, because he has this real personal pride that he's only ever lost one case. So you're not a prosecutor.
Yeah.
You're a doctor, you're an expert witness. It's not, you don't win or lose cases. Your job is to
present
evidence from an objective perspective and come to a conclusion, not to build a prosecution.
Yeah.
That's, even just those words, that should be enough for an appeal.
Yeah, it does absolutely stink to high heaven. There's a few bits and pieces. So
before we get in, is this the listeners that have submitted some of these questions? Is where we're going with this?
Yeah. So I've got a couple of little bits and pieces that are worth bringing up, and then we've got some these are questions and comments.
Before we get into the wonderful listener questions, my dad's got a question.
Yeah.
Because it came up this morning. I was having a coffee with him, and basically he's not listened to anything we've done on this so far, but he's heard kind of where the general public, I think, is with us at the moment. We're aware of Lucy Letby via the media, but everybody is kind of going, this feels a little bit off. Something's really not quite right. So he's kind of in that position with it. And I said, we've kind of starting to come down pretty solidly on we think this might have been a miscarriage of justice situation. So the first thing he asked was, but the deaths. So I know we've covered this before, but I think it probably is just worth reiterating in quite plain English at the beginning of this. The deaths that happened, just briefly, why do you think that, or what evidence leads you to believe that basically there is no foul play here?
Okay, so 6 of the babies had postmortems that found natural causes, and 1 didn't have a postmortem. So there's no evidence that can be concluded from that. Although the doctors seem to have persuaded the parents out of having a post-mortem in that one, and they gave a hypothesis about some cause of death. I cannot remember specifically. That I think a coroner has actually said that they think is a bit off. So it looks as if the hospital might have suspected that they had some culpability in that one and pushed the parents off having an autopsy. And the other 6 ones, it looks like it was sepsis or infection.
Yeah.
Prior to sepsis, that was enough to cause them issues probably from the Pseudomonas that was. So the first baby death that she is accused of was June 2015, and the Pseudomonas was found in May 2015.
Mm-hmm. So I think the reason why this is relevant to my dad and other people that be kind of glancing at this, if you just Google the timeline of events, or we'll see Letby baby deaths, because now we're after the court ruling, the timelines will say she killed, she did this. That's the term.
Yeah, I know.
So it's what you just said there is, I think we're taking this as the reality of the situation, basically. But the way that it's now presented is that this is the cause of death. This was found to be the cause of death. This is what happened, even though the reports don't actually state the same thing. But what the court found is now not really the evidence as such. That's the ruling.
Yeah.
The media are now twisting it to this. This is why my dad asked the question.
Yeah.
Was that if he's had the same thought, a lot of people have started to talk about this seems a little bit off, but trying to information gather on it is quite difficult because of how the media have opted to cover this story.
And so one of the problems you have as well is that there's this assertion that the unit was only having 2 to 3 deaths a year. Well, the year before 2014, they'd had 4 deaths, and the year before that, they'd upgraded to a level 2 unit from a level 1 unit, so they'd started taking more poorly babies. So what you have is austerity and lack of funding for the NHS coming in 2010. There's an uptick all across the UK in infant mortality and maternal mortality. I believe the poorer outcomes as a result of lack of funding. As that lack of funding filters in on the ground, if you certainly resources run out. So yeah, I think it was either 2012 or 2013 that they started taking more vulnerable, younger, more poorly babies. The year after that, they then have 4 deaths as opposed to 2 or 3. The year after that, it's 7. And so across the 2 years that she's accused, there were 17 deaths, but she's only charged with 7 of them. So the other thing to say, and I think I mentioned this in the first one, is that there was also more stillbirths. And so you're not looking, if you're saying that she's responsible for 7, you've still got to explain the other spike.
Yes, yeah. I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay. There's also the sort of argue that statisticians have been making that the spike is not a spike. They're saying, there is natural variance, and there's a necessity for that kind of variance when you're saying that you have 3 to 4 deaths a year. You can't have 3.5 deaths.
No, you either have 3 or 4.
Yeah, so there will be years where you have more, and there will be years where you have less.
Mm-hmm.
So the spike isn't a spike. And obviously we spoke previously about loads of statisticians after the details of the case were made public coming forward and going, whoa, this is not
how you do it
at all. So now the rebuttal has been, well, the case is nothing to do with statistics. And the rebuttal to the rebuttal is, the statistics are the entire case. Without the statistics, there is no case at all.
Nobody ever saw her do anything. There is no evidence whatsoever. The only evidence that you've put forward to say that it's her is that you say that she's there for all the ones that you consider suspicious. So, but what you consider suspicious seems to be entirely dependent upon her being present, and there's a little bit more evidence to prove that. So, last time we went through the case of Baby K and that kind of timeline and how it looked like actually it wasn't even her; it was probably a different nurse. We've got another one where this door where the data was the wrong way around. So when at the second trial, that door data was revealed to have been the wrong way around. The police said they'd reviewed all the cases and it didn't make any difference in any of the other ones. Who can guess whether or not that was true?
Is this not taking us back to also trying to get the transcripts out of the courts as well?
Yeah, I think
because we want to know exactly how said evidence was presented the first and second time, so we don't actually know. So,
I think so. I think they've raised the money, and there are people who are now reviewing stuff. And there was also quite a good log kept by the local newspaper in Chester. So I think a lot of stuff has been reviewed through that. But anyway. So there is somebody that's done some analysis, and one of the babies, baby N. So she was convicted of attempting to murder baby N during the night shift of June the 2nd to the 3rd. So, it was 1 a.m. on the 3rd, so the early morning of the 3rd. So the nurse that was taking care of the baby was a guy called Christopher Booth, and he went off on his break at 1 a.m. And he left another nurse taking care of the baby, and there's no record of who that nurse is, so the prosecution asserts that it's Lucy Letby. There is a note from in the medical records when he comes back on saying that the baby had been crying for about half an hour. So the prosecution's allegation is that at 1:05 Lucy Letby, while taking care of the baby, inflicted some sort of trauma or injury on the baby, although there is no indication that there was any injury on the baby, but that's what they say, and that this caused the baby to cry hard for half an hour. And this half an hour is based on them saying that that note from the nurse, there was also information from the doctor, a doctor that had attended, and the doctor was alleged to have swiped in to the unit at 7 minutes past and swiped out at 20 past to attend a crash call, and then come back at some point later. And by the time she came back later, or he came back later, this doctor, that baby was then asleep. So the assertion was that the baby had cried very, very hard for half an hour. And Dowie Evans had reviewed this and said, right, so that's her. She's injured the baby to the extent that the baby's cried for half an hour solid. The only problem is that door date is the wrong way around. The doctor didn't leave at 1:20. The doctor came back at 1:20. So the doctor attended the baby to the crying at about 5 past and had then had a crash call and gone off the ward at 1:07 and had come back at 1:20, so just over 15 minutes later, by which time the baby is now asleep. So the baby didn't cry for half an hour. This whole thing just didn't even happen. Also, right in the middle of this, Lucy Letby at 1:15 is swiping in through another door into the main building of the unit, so she's not even there.
Yeah.
So this whole swipe thing, that's one other case so far, and people are going through. I mean, I imagine it's quite a laborious process trying to review what's been said and what affected what. But she just doesn't even seem to have been there, and there isn't even any record saying that she was the nurse that was left looking after her. It doesn't look like she could have been because she wasn't there. She swipes in at 1:15, so at 1 a.m. she's not there.
Well, that baby couldn't have been murdered then if Lucy Letby wasn't there, because that is the only indicator that a baby was murdered is the presence of Lucy Letby.
It would appear to be. So, I mean, just to, I could go through the timeline and stuff, but it doesn't actually really matter. Everything you need is in that. She's not there.
Yeah.
She's not there.
That happened a couple of times during the trial. I was sort of half listening to where during the trial, while it was already underway, they realised that at least 2 of the babies that Lucy Letby was accused of murdering could not possibly have been because she had no prior interaction with them at all.
Yeah, well, that was baby C. We talked about that last time. So that's the one where the X-ray had been taken, and this had got the X-ray was shown at the trial. So right up until the trial, it doesn't seem to have been realised by them that not only had she not been working that day, she'd never had any time at all on the ward with that baby. She'd gone off shift at 10 a.m. The baby was born the same afternoon. The X-ray was, so that was on the 10th. The baby was born on the 10th in the afternoon. On the 12th, the X-ray was taken. She wasn't back on shift until the 13th. And when they found that out, they just decided that she'd killed the baby some other way instead. Even though 3 people had reviewed the X-ray and said, oh yeah, that's definitely. It went from that X-ray definitely means somebody did something to something else caused the baby to die because the baby died when she was on shift. So it can't have been that. Right, so you were all wrong about that, were you? Right. Any chance you were wrong about anything else?
I mean, I will just reiterate the point again. So I think it was The Guardian that I looked at the timeline.
Yeah.
So my dad asked that question about the deaths. The language use is she killed them by this method at this time.
Yeah.
This is a fact. And then what you were just established.
It's a legal fact.
Not at least one, at least several of these. She is not physically there.
Yeah.
And the way there's no distinction how this is being broadcast by the media about, as you say, the distinction between fact and the ruling of the court.
It's
are 2 different
things,
in my view.
It is, and this is a problem with the way these things are always reported, is that it is a legal fact. That doesn't make it true, but it is a legal fact in much the same way that the Tories tried to rule that Rwanda was a safe country, irrespective of whether or not it was, so that we could say, well, no, it's a safe country. We've ruled that it's a safe country. Okay, you can rule that blue is green, but it's not.
Yes. So you can see how the bigger questions about how the justice system works start to come into play here.
Yeah.
How this is actually a way to alter reality and people's perceptions of reality.
Yeah, and to what Phil Hammond says regarding the expert witnesses, he's absolutely right. But one of the reasons the Child Death Oversight Panel has been set up is precisely so that a mixture of specialists, including law enforcement, can review cases prior to it ever going to court.
Yeah. I almost think the thing that we probably have circled around quite a few times in the last couple of episodes, but even if she was guilty of all this, the questions that aren't really being asked is, well, how the fuck was this able to happen? But we don't want to address any of that because if we're well established, that starts to raise questions about how wards are run, the state of the NHS, the funding.
Absolutely.
So they're not wanting that. They just want to focus on this evil devil woman and continue that narrative because even if she is actually guilty, they don't want to pick at that any more than they are.
Time and time again at the Thirlwell inquiry, witnesses are given evidence and they're basically being asked, well, why didn't you do anything? And why wasn't this action taken? And time again, the response is, because there wasn't any evidence. We didn't see anything. Nobody brought us anything that could prove anything. There were people casting aspersions, but they didn't have any evidence. And so what are you meant to do? Because we're not fucking psychic is essentially what people are saying. And it's like, the Thirlwell inquiry, despite itself, is unintentionally revealing the truth, which is that this ward was a fucking disaster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing they just don't want to have front and centre on the news, because that becomes a much larger question about institutions.
No, and I mean, somewhere there was a lovely explanation in this Sweden podcast comparing it to like football leagues. In any given year, someone's going to get promoted, someone's going to get relegated, someone's got to be the best, someone's got to be the worst, and the best and the worst are going to be quite a long way away from the mean. And one of the problems with something like this is that, the Pseudomonas is almost certainly responsible for a lot, but it won't be the only thing. It's the Swiss cheese thing where you've got a whole load of problems lining up so that the holes are all just lining up right, that the problem can fly right through the middle of your holes.
That's air crash investigation.
Yeah.
It's exactly that. It's never just one thing. It's a series of
things
that create that, it's a perfect line to the accident.
Yeah.
And that is not the case here. None of that really lines up at all, because they're trying to find evidence to fit a narrative rather than the facts, building that coherent narrative right away.
One of the experts, it was interviewed by John Sweeney, was the neonatologist who had been a professor at Cambridge, has written over 300 papers. And one of the deaths we're discussing, and he said, "What would your assertion be? Like, what do you think caused this?" And he said, "Well, it had bile, bile coloured vomit. That is a real indication that there is something going on, and they just didn't look into it.
Yeah.
They just left the baby. You don't have to look any further than that. This is not a team of competent doctors. That's enough."
So, things that have come out the Sweeney podcast has been great, actually. I always quite like him anyway. I sort of like the cut of his jib. But
he's very blunt about the whole thing.
He's great.
In an effective manner, because we kept getting a lot of it. Can we address the YouTube comments? We're about to get into your questions. See these fucking losers that keep saying that we swear too much on this.
Fuck off.
Yeah. We're not going to change the approach here.
We do this for free. You listen to it for free. Get fucked.
Yeah, don't ever come to Glasgow, mate. You'll need.
You're listening to the Angry Scotland podcast, motherfucker. What we expect.
He also does the same thing. He will just say it's like sinks full of shit.
Yeah.
He says they are sinks full of shit.
It
is more effective to say that and be blunt about it to underline the point than to do this, how the mainstream media have covered it, which is all very nice and polite and dignified. But
the sinks were full of shit. There was shit in the sinks week after week after week. The plumber was getting called in every week to fix problems. They had cast iron pipes that were they become porous, they become brittle and porous, and so microbes can escape through that. There would have been bacteria everywhere. The unit was a fucking disaster, and the sinks were full of shit.
Yeah,
I actually think babies dying because in this day and age we can't clean up shit is worth swearing about, quite frankly. Mothers dying because of shit.
If
it's not the Middle Ages. We know that shit's an issue.
If you're sort of more morally outraged by the F word than you are by the prospect that babies died unnecessarily and an innocent person is potentially in jail, then I don't know, go fuck yourself, I think.
My only issue with John Sweeney is that his name is too close to John Swinney.
Was this confusion all the time?
Because you put a message into our group chat, Tucker, and it was, I think John Sweeney might have listened to one of our podcasts. They're saying quite similar thing. And then Laura got very excited because she thought the First Minister of Scotland was listening in on what.
I was like, does he hear me call Kate Forbes? I can't.
There. It probably is more likely that John Swinney listens to this than John Sweeney listens to it. I feel I can't really imagine either do, to be honest.
I think they're just reviewing the same material.
It was quite satisfying though, obviously, then, because I think his one has started up later than our first one, or it's about the same time.
Yeah. Although he'd been fundraising for a wee while, so it's seen.
Was satisfying hearing him say a lot of the same stuff that you were saying.
Because we're going. Well,
I was based on research you'd read and so forth.
Yeah,
keeps echoing a lot of your sentiments.
There is this. So it turns out that I told you there's an account called The Trials of Lucy Letby, and I said it was. I thought it was she, and it is a she. And now no, she's a Brazilian journalist actually, and she's an investigative journalist, and she seems to have spotted this quite early on and just taken an interest. And she has been running an account on Twitter that just goes and she posts any articles she can find about it and information. She clearly thinks Letby is innocent. She's attended the Thirlwell inquiry. She's attended the second trial. She was the first person to put out that the swipe door data was the wrong way around, and no media publication was putting this out, and you could see that she was absolutely wanted to scream, but she's so professional about the way she's running this account. I've got so much admiration for her.
Is she on Blue Sky?
She is, but she's not really using it. She's still on Twitter. I have to sneak onto Twitter to read stuff. But her name is Chrissy D'Oliveira.
Sort of in the groups of these people. There will be.
I'm not now. I've left Twitter.
Of course you are. I forgot you. You finally deleted. You did the right thing. But I was going to say that there is.
Let's sneak back on immediately.
There's apps you can get now which will allow you to. It mirrors. So basically, if you post on Twitter, it will mirror it directly onto Blue Sky. So I was just saying that if there are journalists out there that, for the reasons you were using previous of why you wanted to stay, it probably now is worth making the time to set one of those up. There's a version of it even with like the BBC. It's not done by the BBC. Someone created a bot to basically ghost BBC news alerts and stuff.
I haven't looked how to do that, but it was kind of
it's
probably got somebody else. It was a few weeks back when I first moved over to Blue Sky, but
anyway.
So there's a few other bits and pieces that are worth raising before we go to the question. So one is that the hospital themselves, I think in 2015, did a review of the cases at the behest of the doctors, and it came back saying that there wasn't any correlation actually to Lucy Letby. And you can see in this email that they're actually disappointed, and I've got a segment of it to read to you, because I think it's really telling, because their response wasn't, oh, that's great, thank goodness that it isn't her, because obviously we all really like her because she's such a good nurse. Instead it was, I'm keen to see the data, because if there really were many such cases, then I'm not sure that these were the specific ones that were highlighted as being unusual or unexpected. And if the staff analysis was undertaken for too many of the collapses, then that might have obscured an unusual correlation between certain staff and those unusual and unexpected collapses. So basically, well, yeah, if we do a really wide review of the data, she doesn't show up. But if we only highlight the ones where we think it's her, then it probably is her.
Yeah.
Who can see what's wrong with this?
Yeah. There's a thing called data manipulation.
Yeah. So the point is, if an effect is real, this is a classic thing that if you do some sort of clinical trial, you do a study, and you get what you perceive as a significant result, statistically significant result, the first thing you should do is repeat it with a larger sample to see if it's still there, because small samples are prone to large margins of error. That's why big polls are better than small polls.
See, I have a memory of being taught some of this in high school. When you've mentioned this to me in the podcast, like, a lot of this is it's jogging a memory in my head, going like, I'm sure that we looked at this, but as we discussed like averages and how all this actually works, and at that exact point you made there about taking like an isolated thing and putting it into a bigger picture to ensure
this is bad data science.
It's terrible data science. This is why things like the Cochrane Institute exist, whereby they'll take all the studies about one thing that they can and find all the points that match to give themselves massive studies that they can then review to see whether effects are real, whether drugs are effective and things like that. This is a known thing. It's common fucking sense.
Well, I think that's it. The common sense is the term, because when you first started on this, it just sort of, I'm not a clever person, and immediately I'm like, they've done what? Hang on. You start doing that really quickly.
Yeah.
That's the most shocking part about it.
It very much seems like it's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, which is where, you fire a load of bullets against the side of a shed, and then you find the half a dozen that are clumped together and draw a circle around them and say, hey, I'm a sharp shot. No, you're not. You drew the circle afterwards.
There's a sort of fundamental tenet of science that if your results are not reproducible, then they're not worth.
Well, this is the thing, and the review of so how Dowie Evans arrived at the cases that were problematic is in itself problematic. So he's always said, I didn't know who she was, I didn't reach any conclusions, but he didn't review the case notes blinded. The names of the staff were all over them. So that's the first thing to say. So as she was there so much more often than other staff, because I had a lot of temp staff, they had a lot of nurses that were only there part-time, and they wouldn't have been allowed anywhere near the sickest babies, whereas she was, because she was the only one with the full qualification for the intensive care that was working on the unit. So she's there so much more at the time. So even if he wasn't or hadn't already been told that he was looking to see whether or not she'd done anything. And I personally don't believe that he wasn't. I think he was told that. But even if he hadn't been, he would just keep seeing her name. The record should have been blinded. That's one thing to say.
There's quite a lot of that going on too, with this sort of subtle manipulation,
Yeah.
well-intentioned people. We mentioned with the swipe door data, the idea of people giving statements, but then possibly by the police going, yeah, but according to the door data, Jan is here, even though they don't know at that time that's incorrect. Other people started to adjust their memories according to that. So it's not that anyone is intentionally doing this, but by a series of, to come back to the Swiss cheese analogy, it's more like that. It's like a series of fuck up, as opposed to coherent narrative forming down the line to show what actually happened.
Yeah.
More evidence of institutional error as opposed to institutional, or not institutional, but like deliberate criminality.
But something that gives lie to this idea that he wasn't told that is something that's come up. I'm assuming this is at the Thirlwell inquiry. Again, I'm just kind of trawling through other people's stuff, but there's a note, there's minutes from a meeting with him and the cops in 2017 regarding how he was going to submit it. Regarding how he was going to review the inquiry. Which room is the baby in at the time the nurse was on shift? What other babies were in the room? What medical staff were in the room for the duration of the shift? Which room is the baby in at the time the nurse was on shift? The nurse. Right there, right at the beginning.
That sentence is not the babies. The subject of that inquiry is the nurse. So we again are building a case backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the conclusion bias. It's the same thing. As I was saying to my dad this morning in the coffee shop, it's like the 9/11's an inside job theory where, yeah, you can find, inverted commas, facts that make that seem plausible. But in order for that to make sense, you have to discount all the facts that prove that it's absolutely not the case.
And just because something feels true, just because you are operating from a place of righteous fury and indignation, you think an injustice has been committed. Because something feels true doesn't make it true. You have to approach these things objectively, and also just doesn't seem capable of.
I think also the odds of like common sense and coming into play again, where it's like, what is more likely? Like a crazy mad nurse with no history of being crazy and mad, murdering a whole bunch of babies, or the NHS being badly run. Like, just the way that like they immediately dove on it must be the crazy nurse theory, as opposed to just doing a gentle bit of to conclude the more likely thing is probably true.
There's a lovely.
They're not equipped to investigate this kind of thing. Either they do not have the expertise. Don't have.
They do have the ability not to keep. No, I agree with you there, but they also probably shouldn't have continued.
They reached out to a medical expert because they don't have the expertise, and that medical expert looked at one set of case notes for 10 minutes and said there's been a murder.
There's
the chief detective who ran the case. There's this little clip of him going, I mean, we've got all these medical notes and they're all written in medical jargon, and you just think, oh God, you're thick as pig shit. Medical jargon.
Yeah, it is. I do think that the most likely scenario here is that there is no one person with an evil agenda who's like rubbing their hands together in glee and going like, hee, I got it. I think that, and for Dowie Evans in particular, like I don't think that he's necessarily a bad man, but I do think that his major character flaw from what I've observed is hubris.
Yes.
Just absolutely unwilling to accept that he's made any kind of mistake.
Even when he self-evidently has made a mistake, he won't admit that he's made a mistake. So like with Baby C and the X-ray, he just backs out of it and says something else and does not in any way interact with the truth of the fact, which is that but you said this.
Yeah.
It's infuriating. Another thing that's come up as a result of the John Sweeney podcast is that so we talked on the last episode about this case about baby Noah, who had died, I think, in 2014. So it now turns out that the doctor that was responsible for his death through her negligence and not listening, like she'd got medical equipment telling her that things were in the wrong place, an X-ray showing that it was in the wrong place, the oxygen read saying that the baby was not getting oxygen and all the rest of it. And she just ignored it all and thought she'd done it right. Her name is obscured. We're not allowed to know who it is because of, it turns out, of this case, I think. So she is referred to as Dr. B, and she is one of the 4 that accused Lucy Letby. And she was involved in the cases of, in the care of the babies O and P, who died, and then I think there were 2 of the triplets. She is apparently a smoker, and she was going out for fags all the time. On one occasion, she missed a crash call. And she was coming back in, reeking of fags, not going and washing her hands and going straight into the babies. Now, this is only something that I'm vaguely aware of, is that if you're a smoker, you're really advised not to have your baby in bed with you, because you actually kind of emit fumes that are dangerous to babies. I don't think that necessarily the brief interaction of that would perhaps be enough to be dangerous, but I don't know that.
Do you know that the chemicals that are in cigarettes, like, they have fucking formaldehyde in, like those, and the smoke does linger, as in Hicks smoke.
Yeah.
The smoke lingers. It lingers on your hair. It lingers on your skin. It's on your clothes. It's whether or not you can smell it because you're used to it. If you're working with tiny babies, because again, as an ex-smoker who was going and visiting friends who had newborn babies, not a chance I'd be having a cigarette before going in, or like going in with it, washing my hands. Absolutely not. No, just no.
It's one of those things you just think, what? I mean, you cannot help but think that she is obviously not a good doctor. But the other consultants all rallied around her to get her to make sure she kept her job after she caused a baby's death.
Yeah, because I think that's the thing, that with Lucy being initially accused, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that she had filed reports, concerns about
that seems to be the case.
Quality of the ward, and it sort of tracks in my head that a nurse that was, let's say, less caring about all that shit, so was actually more seen to be kind of on sides with the management in that regard, is that I'm not going to rock the boat here. So the one that's rocked the boat, for the sake of the greater good, is the one this has all been pinned on, but she's been left in the lurch. So
I mean,
she's been, Delman's been left to get away with it. Rather, she's not been called out for what you've just called her out for, being unprofessional. And also the fact is, am I right in saying that the smoking areas where you said you missed a crash call, does that mean that they don't carry any devices on their physical person?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure they have. I'm sure they have. Well, you used to always be pagers and stuff, doesn't it?
Americans have pagers. I don't know what they.
I don't know, really. I'm not sure. I don't know the details of that, I'll be honest. I just know that that's been asserted. But I think Letby was complaining about her, and the parents were certainly complaining about her because they were horrified by the fact that she was coming back in from a fag and not washing her hands, and then going into the babies. It's just bleh.
It's just such a stark difference between. So here we have a case where there has been a death that was preventable. It's been caused through like malpractice, essentially.
Yeah.
And the way that the doctor was treated, she has been granted anonymity. She has the full support of the other doctors, consultants, and the management.
Yeah.
And there is all the evidence in the world, hard physical evidence, witnesses that this doctor caused this death. Whether or not it was malicious doesn't really matter. This doctor did cause this baby's death. When we've been talking about all of these other tragedies associated with this case, there's just not the same weight of evidence at all.
No.
That any of the deaths were caused by human intervention. A lot of it does seem to be natural death. A lot of it does seem to have been as a result of the shit in the sinks.
Yeah.
And just a generally.
And something that I suspect is, so Lucy was often discussed as being a really good nurse and an observant nurse. Something that I have wondered is whether or not she was better at spotting early signs of babies' declines and therefore calling doctors and therefore being the person that's associated with it because she's the one picking up something.
This is where she gets that kind of like touch of death rep from, is the fact that she's basically just through her own intelligence and observations, it's like she's got antenna for this, but to those not giving her a fair shake, they see that as like, oh, that sort of feels like self-fulfilling prophecy, like you're killing the babies, as opposed to just going, our ward's a big piece of shit, mate, gonna fucking raise your standards.
I know.
It's like the nursing home cats who...
exactly what I was thinking of.
And like, this cat's an omen of death. It's like, no, it just senses something that you don't. It's when they go to the person who's going to die that night. It's like, the cat is bringing death to me. It's like, no, you're 105 years old. You're going to die.
Actually, do you know what they've worked out is that a lot of the time when the cats are going to those people because they've got heated blankets.
Really?
Yeah, some of the actually
knowing cats, yes, also.
Yeah, that was like how, because there was a sort of like, this cat seems to know when someone's going to die or when someone's ill.
That's like a Sherlock Holmes moment, isn't it?
I was like,
you saw but you did not observe it, and like obviously the cat just wants the heat. It's nothing to do with the death. Yes,
they are heat vampires.
But it is just that total conflation of correlation and causation.
I saw a lovely quote from somebody. Everybody that confuses causation with correlation eventually ends up dead. And there was just to come back to that kind of sort of Bayesian probability thing of the whole thing of what's more likely, is it the NHS or is it, the random serial killer health professional? John Sweeney came up with this lovely statement, which was that when you hear hooves, you should think horses before you think zebras, and you should think zebras before you think unicorns. Yeah. A serial killer is a unicorn. The NHS being filthy is just horses.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Right. I'm not going to read out some of these handles because they're long, complicated and weird. So if you hear your question, you got it in, but I'm not going to get the name. So the first one says, when crimes are reported to police usually hold all people who are present as suspects pending the investigation. Why then did Cheshire Police allow the consultants to be eliminated from an investigation and deleted from the statistics table that showed only nurses present, not everyone present? It's a frequent occurrence that people who report a crime are sometimes the perpetrators. So why were they removed? I think I mentioned this actually on the first episode. That makes no sense unless, of course, it was designed and targeted for that purpose.
Yeah, so I would agree entirely. I think it's incredibly suspicious that the consultants went directly to the police when they knew that the route they should be going to was the CDOP. There is a panel that can be convened that consists of multidisciplinary professionals from social services, medical, and the police that would normally review these things. And instead, they went directly to the police, told the police that they obviously told the police that it was that they suspected Lucy Letby and that the hospital wasn't doing anything. The hospital had, in fact, had multiple reviews and continually kept coming back with that there wasn't any evidence that Lucy had done anything wrong at all. And only when they lost their grievance did they then go to the police. So it all looks like it was in bad faith. The police ought to have investigated them, but they didn't. Instead, they actually allowed them to be part of the investigation, assisting the investigation. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It should not have happened this way. I don't know what to tell you. Arrive at your own conclusions as to why.
Next question, or input at least, because actually a lot of these aren't really questions, they're just opinions.
Statements.
Yeah, so Lucy Letby was transferred to administration duties in June 2016.
Yeah.
In June 2016, the NICU downgraded from admitting 27-week gestation preterms to 32 weeks. At the time, the NICU reduced their beds by 25%. They also employed more consultants.
And at the time, a legal note has been discovered where, at the time that this happened, one of the hospital's lawyers said to them, because of the changes you've made on the unit, I am paraphrasing it, because of the changes you've made on the unit, deaths will go down anyway. And this might be inferred as being proof that Letby has done it. Letby is responsible, but you can't really infer that because the deaths are going to go down anyway because you've now improved the quality of care and reduced the vulnerability of the babies that will be in there.
Once Lucy was on admin duties, the unit did everything possible for the number of deaths to drop off a cliff. Funny thing is, all they did was actually run the unit how it should have been operating in the first place. Twice daily walk-rounds, taking less babies and not taking the more serious cases outside of their capabilities. It's an abomination from start to finish. Shut there, isn't it? The Care Quality Commission report is worth taking a look at. The inspection team was at the COCH from February 16th, 2016 to March 4th, 2016. The neonatal ward was inspected as well. Many problems listed in the report.
And I mean, I think Sweeney's podcast goes into that, and I mean, it's not difficult to see, like, time and time again, when the hospital tried to review these claims that the doctors were making about Lucy Letby, what kept coming out was actually the ward's a shit show.
Yeah. The massive role that sepsis played at this crucial time even explains the baby's skin marks. Why is the NHS not owning up?
Yeah, something we've not talked about a lot, because I just didn't feel like I was competent to speak about it, was there was this reporting after the fact by the doctors about the babies having weird rashes, and they tried to say that this was a result of air embolism. But babies who are preterm, often their skin is not quite fully formed and it's quite translucent. So they're much more prone to showing things on their skin, and it can be quite transient anyway. And there's all sorts of things like the baby being cold or the baby having an infection that will cause mottling and things like that. The consultants and Dowie Evans cited a paper regarding these rashes, and at one of the appeal applications, they actually got the person that wrote this paper to come and say that what the rashes that were being described did not actually match what he was talking about in his paper. It was refused to be allowed into evidence because they said it should have actually been presented at the first trial. So that's the sort of technicality that this evidence isn't allowed in. But what is odd is that two sets of people who are supposedly not speaking to each other arrived at the same paper that the person who writes the paper says doesn't actually apply. That's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do we think that happened?
Ask any high school teacher when two people get the same wrong answers, what that generally leads to, and it's, he looked at my paper.
Yeah, exactly.
Copy my homework.
And the other thing to say is that none of these doctors reported any of these strange rashes at the time.
Just see, most of these comments are from YouTube, so if you do want to reply to any of them, that's the place to go, is find the episodes on YouTube and then just reply to the person reading them. Okay, next one. The doctor that was present for a lot of the deaths may have also been present for deaths where Lucy was not present, e.g. some of those that she was originally suspected of harming but then let off because she wasn't on shift. I'd be interested to know who was present for the most deaths. Could there be a bias in suspecting her over someone else who also present for the same/similar number of deaths?
Yes, and I mean, I think we've established that we had a very, very incompetent doctor with poor hygiene standards who was working on that ward.
Yeah.
And I'll just leave it at that.
Comment here from our individual saying, as a retired police officer, I am convinced that Lucy Letby is innocent. So take that for what it is.
Yeah.
Next one. I had two people I vaguely know die this year. The young son of a friend and my great uncle. In both cases, the first thing I did was look up their family on Facebook. All it means is I was thinking of them. So if we could just bring context to that, this is as this thing the media kind of ran with, was her looking up.
Saying that her, the thing is, she looked up loads of people. She would routinely look up the families of the babies that she had cared for. And all that says to me is that she was thinking about them.
Yep. Next input. I agree the jury trial was a part of the problem, but if only experts are involved, how can we ensure trials are independent? If only doctors were making decisions behind closed doors, this could be a complete kangaroo court where nothing and absolutely nothing comes out.
I would agree entirely, but we already have the situation where we have the CDOP, which is, as discussed, not that. It's social workers, health professionals, and police who all act together. So the bias of any one profession should hopefully not be permitted to rule.
Well, true, but you could have an expert jury, equal funding on each side, transparency to the public, and release the CCTV to the public at the conclusion of the trial.
Agree.
One different hospital she worked in had a 1% rate of breathing/feeding tubes being dislodged until Letby worked there, where it went up to 40%. I wonder why that was.
Yeah, so this has been something that got reported. It was allowed into the Thirlwell inquiry without any rebuttal, because she's not allowed to have any legal representation there. It's actually not true. The way it's been presented is that it's two different sets of figures. I can't quite remember the details. There's somebody's run a statistical analysis on it. It's two different things. It's like 1% of 1% of cases will a baby, like 1% of the time will a baby kick its tube out, and they're saying, well, and it's 40% of her shifts, but that's 1% of cases as opposed to shifts. So you've got two different things being measured, and a statistician did say if you've got 7 nurses running 7 babies, what are the chances therefore if you do the sums on whether or not there'll be an intubation that'll fail on a shift, and it came out something like 38%. So It's just one of these things where it's like, well, yeah, but see, apples are apples and oranges are oranges. And it seems almost deliberately misworded. Whoever it was, I'm sure that. No, I'm not saying that person has misworded it. Like they've seen an article that did say that, but it's not. It's two different. It's two different measurements being cited as if they're the same as each other, and they're not.
Says here, her defence was bloody awful. If common people are able to pick it apart, it makes me wonder if they were working with the prosecution.
I don't think they have to be. I think there's something that I have wondered is whether or not her barrister thought she was guilty and therefore did what he would do for a guilty client, which is a strong rebuttal of the evidence of the prosecution, rather than a really aggressive
building a case for her
innocence. I don't know that, but that's something that I've wondered. But I think often it is just, I think it's a failure that people in the legal profession have to understand that lay people don't think the way they do about their injury. They think, I haven't got to prove you're innocent, they've got to prove you're guilty. In theory, yes. In practice, that's not how it fucking works, and you ought to know that by now.
Yeah. Lucy had her whole life, including what she looks like, completely edited to create a false profile of who she actually is. Follow on from this is, it amazed me how Evans described every baby as completely stable and healthy, even the ones with sepsis, pneumonia, and they were intubated. Even a strong adult with pneumonia and sepsis is going to have a high chance of dying, let alone a premature neonate.
Yeah, so there's what that comment is referring to is that there's a photograph that does the rounds all the time. I think it was a sort of mugshot photograph of her, that she looks incredibly blank. And somebody had actually noticed that it was the same photograph as the mugshot, but that the coloration on it looks slightly different. And they did an analysis and they're like, yeah, it is definitely the same photograph. Every strand of hair is in the same place. But on the original photograph, she's obviously been crying her eyes out. She's all puffy and red. And they've just taken all...
saturated it.
Yeah, taken all that out. So she looks really blank.
She got the carbon treatment.
I was literally about to say, it's like from the news company that brought you the carbon in the Soviet hats.
Yeah.
They've done it again, folks. Cancel your TV license. You can do it at any time.
Yeah, so that's what that's referring to. And yes, the overstatement of the well-being of these babies has been like, they're all incredibly stable. All these collapses were unexpected, this, that, and the other. Well, no, they were all preterm babies in a filthy hospital on intubation with potential sepsis, in a ward where we know there was an infection doing the rounds, and the doctors, maybe they were unexpected because the doctors hadn't fucking seen them. One of the babies at the point of its collapse, they'd been there 3 days and at no point seen a consultant. So, yeah, it will be unexpected if you haven't actually seen it.
Yeah, when you're only rounding, twice a week?
It was twice a week at the time they were doing rounds, yeah.
Once defence accepts that murder has taken place, then Lucy Letby was lost. Total failure of her defence.
Yeah, I agree. The insulin cases, and this is what they're referring to there, the insulin cases were the ones where the defence accepted the prosecution's assertion that the bags had been tampered with. Subsequent to that, obviously, evidence has been put forward that suggests they probably never were. But at the time, it'd been presented to her as fact that these bags had been tampered with. So at this point, you can imagine Letby is thinking, so somebody on the ward was doing something. It was not me, but somebody on the ward was doing something, and she accepts that, thinking that she will be able to make the case that it wasn't her. But I don't actually think there were.
Ben Myers was certainly negligent in agreeing with the prosecution that babies had been poisoned with insulin, but Lucy's defence seems to be woefully inadequate as a poll on so many levels. Shocking, really. Someone says we are a great podcast. Another great podcast, ooh. And one that further confirms that not one single aspect of the prosecution case stands out to any kind of meaningful scrutiny. One thing that continues to surprise me, though, is the absence of discussion about a supposed serial killer using an array of different methods to attack their victims. Based on historical evidence, that must be a pretty implausible scenario. And I think I was talking about how the methods don't really add up to
none of it.
Or anything.
No, none of it. Not to mention that at no point was there ever any proof that any of these things happened, though these were always the conjectures of Dowie Evans, who seems to have quite a fertile imagination for ways to kill babies.
One of the methods changed on the fly during the case for
the BBC.
Which you would think if that was any other... If this trial was just... for the murder of BBC, if it hadn't been, for all the baby deaths, like this is what she's on trial for. If it was just this one case, imagine like the method of murder changing halfway through the trial. That would be an immediate
red flag.
Yeah.
So this is one of the problems, I think. The fact that all of these cases were run together as one trial meant that the jury, went on months and months and months, and I think there's probably more chance of a miscarriage of justice in a long trial than a short trial, because everybody was going, but the trial went on for months, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, but that means, can you remember something that from 6 months ago and try and put all of that in context?
You also just think that the fact that it got to court, the fact that, so you're in the jury and you're thinking that, well, if this is in court, she must have done something.
Yeah.
Because as we keep highlighting, for it to have gotten to court on the back of nothing feels stupid. It feels implausible. It feels like something the casual citizen would be like, there's no fucking way that could happen. But as we're highlighting, yes, it fucking can, apparently.
But this is one of the problems. So you've got this sort of series of events that allowed it to get to court. So a friend of mine called Guy Rowlands has been making short films. He's made 3 short films now about the case. Little sort of documentaries on YouTube just highlighting issues. And something that surfaced in one of those is that Dowie Evans admitted that the reason he was assuming that there was harm done was because the police were investigating. So he viewed all of these cases through that lens. So the police are trying to decide whether or not there's harm done. So they get an expert, and the expert thinks, well, the police are involved, so there must be harm done.
Jesus Christ. It's just...
I know.
Deep breath.
Guy's films are really good as well. Watch Guy's films.
So, as a sort of reformed libertarian, obviously, like you're
sitting here quite impassive through all of these
government institutions. It's probably not the most favourable, which is good. Taking like the actual details, everything like that aside, what's your perspective on just that something like this can just be allowed to happen and is just widely fucking accepted, that these are institutions that everybody just broadly trusts? What's your take?
Yeah, probably this happens more than we know about. I'm sure this is one of the rare cases where we've actually looks like we're maybe uncovering something. I've tried to stay kind of quiet about the whole topic. I'm very interested in like miscarriages of justice and, you know, institutions behaving badly and stuff like that. But most of the ones I kind of get involved in, it's very clear cut and obvious that, you know, you see the CCTV images, and this is one where it's much harder. You really have to dig in, which does make it seem a lot more shady that there's such a lack of kind of really clear evidence that she's done anything wrong. I just don't have the time to dedicate to read up and all the detail.
Best for you to listen.
So I'm enjoying just listening and finding out that way. I don't think I can add anything useful at all to any of it, because there's so many other people who are more knowledgeable about it that have said really, you know, have delved into it really deeply.
I mean, as much as I feel that like I've been kind of talked round into certainly going from something seems a bit off here to I'm now leaning much more heavily towards I don't think this should have gotten to trial at the very least. But also, you know, Tucker has been doing the bulk of the chit-chat here because you're kind of the one that's actually gone away, done the research and looked into all this. So we're all kind of wise enough to know to ask you questions somewhat. But
Tucker has radicalised me.
Time as well.
You've radicalised me. I'm now a Lucy Letby truther. But I just think it does just beg the larger question of the trust that we put in these institutions.
Can't be used against us.
Yeah, it's like sacrosanct. It's like you would, when you hear about the level of, I mean, farce.
Yeah.
Like actual like comical farce. It's like the legal equivalent of Laurel and Hardy, like carrying a ladder. It's just when you hear this sort of counter evidence and the counter narrative to what has been broadly put out there by the mainstream media. Oh God, that makes me sound so tinfoil hat. But no, when you do hear the facts of the case, it's just so blatant that it does just absolutely reek. Yeah, and like your faith in the institutions that are holding our society together apparently just completely crumbles.
So I've since what am I trying to say here? I don't have any faith in any of those institutions anyway. I've had terrible dealings with the NHS. I've had to try and explain things to policemen and just been absolutely aghast at their lack of curiosity or their inability, or even when you do get curious ones, their inability to do anything with information. I've reported crimes to the police, and what never gets shown in any cop show is that they'll go off duty for 3 days and nobody else touches it and things like that. You know, like stuff just sits. I don't have any great faith. I've been interested in miscarriages of justice for years, and the thing, the very reason that this one piqued my attention is that time and time again when miscarriages of justice that I've read up on or listened to podcasts on, so often it's actually a review after the fact an investigation has stalled and then some other cop picks it up and reviews all the evidence without the contemporary context and arrives at 2 + 2 = Brian. When Brian wasn't even in that state. And it's so common because when the context and the contemporary memories are stripped away from things, it's very easy for people to then misremember or conflate events and things like that, and you can arrive at a completely erroneous conclusion.
I think the thing that triggers me the most about it is that I think a lot of these institutions we're talking about, when there's a screw up, there was a much more honest, like, we just fucked up. I mentioned you've heard about the Swiss cheese thing and how flight safety, a lot of it's based in that idea. Having worked in environments where if you fuck up is critical, that lives are on, you need to put your hands up and say I fucked up. Now there's a threshold there where if you screw something up it's recoverable and then you can kind of run around like a headless chicken and try and solve the problem, and a lot of people will do that. But when it gets down to the wire of I need to own up, most people on the lower rungs will probably do it. And I think what's so infuriating about this is the people that are actually paid the big bucks they have the responsibility. Often they're not doing the most amount of work. The reason why they're on those salaries is that when something goes wrong, they're accountable.
Yeah.
It falls on their shoulders.
I've seen it a lot. I've seen at least 2 pharmacists that I worked with were struck off for trying to cover up discrepancies in controlled drug register accounting. If that was me, as somebody who's not the pharmacist, who's not legally like that's not my responsibility. If there's a problem with controlled drugs, we'll look at it, we'll go through, we'll investigate, we'll see what's happened, and eventually it might just have to be a thing where it's written off. We don't know, maybe it's like gone under a cabinet or something like that. But it's not going to blow back on me. I'm not being paid £60 an hour as a locum pharmacist to have that level of responsibility. 2 people have been struck off by like forging controlled drug records because things went missing. It wasn't malicious. They hadn't hidden the drugs. They just couldn't account for them. So they had just forged the thing and then got struck off. That was it. Your career gone. But it's because
they'd forged it.
I would never have done this because I was pleb. I was pleb levels. Nothing on me.
Yeah. So I think that's just for me personally why I find it infuriating, because I think that a lot of these institutions, they would have a lot more of the public's faith and support. This goes up to politics and everything else. It's so much of it is about arse covering and like running around. We talked about this a lot in the post office scandal episode about you can sort of see the transition point of what's begun as a sort of honest series of mistakes then caves into the people that are paid to be responsible for those kinds of errors going, no, nothing wrong here, we did everything correct. And it's like, fuck you, just like fuck off, because you say the people that aren't earning those monies are the ones that are going to get punished. You are probably the first to file reports saying, I think we've got a system problem here.
Yeah.
I think something's wrong. Like what we're sort of suggesting, that's what we see Letby likely has done and has been punished for that in the most insane manner, for just doing the right thing on the ground level, just like the postmasters were. And I think that's where so many of the problems come in.
A real big difference in accountability as well, from like your top levels of management down to your kind of just like pleb, who'll just get sacked if they make a mistake. Whereas like further up, you got at least like water companies are just like pumping sewage into rivers and they're paying themselves bonuses. Often you see these guys like retiring early when they've screwed up, or been allowed to just leave without any problems. So it's a real difference, right up the ladder.
Basically, the fucking Tony Blair thing, right up to that level of with the Chilcot report, which the report itself could only exist on the grounds that none of it was admissible in court, if I've understood this right. So it basically meant that all Tony had to do was come out and do an apology and then explain for 2 hours to the media why he should never have had to apologise, that he's never actually faced any repercussions meaningfully for any of those actions. He's had a bit of a knock to his public reputation. I mean, that had already happened by going into Iraq in the first place. But, I mean, the man is a multi-millionaire. He's untouchable, basically. And that, as you say, is the difference between people further down the chain that can end up, even if they're innocent, potentially imprisoned, but the people that should be punished are continuously let off the hook. And the only way that's going to change is with massive institutional reform.
Yeah. For example, if you're a CEO of a health insurance company and you're responsible for denying the claims of millions of sick people, and you're responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people, there's really no legal route for justice. I wonder if anyone's going to do it.
Someone famous once said, if you make peaceful revolution impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable.
Yeah, I believe so.
For anyone listening to this in the future,
that was me. That was my quote. I said that.
Just if you're listening 30 years down the pipe and you're being very judgmental, it was the style at the time.
Yeah.
No, it was the style at the time. Okay, next one. Question mark, Netflix? Yes, Dr. J has been very quick to come forward and help with that documentary, despite sitting on the fact that babies might have been being harmed, brackets according to him, for a whole year. I hope to God he doesn't get paid for that, and I think The Watch is a downright lie. So that's a couple of things going on in that.
Yeah, so I would just some of that's just a statement, and the thing about The Watch, what we're talking about there is Baby K and him saying that he remembers looking at his watch at 3:50. I actually give him the benefit of the doubt in this. I don't think it's an outright lie, because there is a prescription written at 3:50, and that would have given him it was either 250 or 350, forgive me, I can't remember, but there's a prescription written at the specific time that he says he remembers writing his watch, and he would have had to check his watch for the time, for the note, for the prescription. I think he simply conflated looking at his watch for the prescription with looking at his watch for when he...
Dr. G?
Ravi Jairam.
Jairam, that's it, yeah, that's fine, thank you.
So
the Netflix thing, I think, is actually that's a wee bit confusing too. I think I mentioned this might one day become quite a compelling Netflix document.
The line of duty writers were thinking about making, and he was reported to be working with them on a serialization, dramatic serialization, but that doesn't look like it's going to go ahead now.
Next one is, it feels a bit like you're reading my mind on the Jairam false memory stuff, but explaining it much better than I could. Oh, for part 3. Just today, would you consider including some of the weird misogyny from the trial? I can't see how the affair with the doctor was relevant, and there's a whiff of if she was sleeping with a married man, what else was she up to? It's a pretty big jump, that, from like shagging about to murdering children, but yeah.
Yeah, well, so firstly, this is not something that we've covered at all, but one of the doctors, not one of the consultants that accused her, but one of the doctors that gave evidence was given anonymity. He's Dr. A. He seems to have been very close to Lisa Letby. He's older than her and he's married. And the prosecution asserted that they'd had an affair, although Letby denied this and the doctor denied this. It was maybe one of those things where they're having a sort of virtual affair, do you know what I mean? Where they're obviously always flirting with each other but nothing actually happens. So it was maybe one of those ones. But he was given anonymity because of this. And I think the prosecution's assertion was that perhaps to some part she was trying to get his attention and she was doing stuff to get him to attend. I don't think they were able to actually prove that that was the case. I don't think it correlated.
Because that's a batshit crazy thing to see.
Yeah, without any evidence. But the point is, I think the way it was portrayed at the trial was that it was all her fault that she was making the running and all the rest of it, as opposed to perhaps thinking that as a nurse in her 20s, he is the person with the position of power, and that if anybody is the person that's abusing power and manipulating, it is much more likely to be the doctor who has coincidentally being given anonymity to protect him.
Wow. Exactly what I was about to say. The problems on the wrong person there completely.
Yeah.
It's just like the sort of slutty nurse archetype that they're trying to push here.
Yeah, precisely.
I don't know if you've ever tried to look sexy by wearing scrubs, but it's not easy. I pulled it off, but it's not easy.
It says here some seriously brilliant work on this one, so I take some credit for that.
Listen, it's none of it is my work. This is all stuff that other people have done. I'm just telling you about it. I can't take any credit for any of that.
Let's see, good stuff. If your theory, which I guess as we're saying, it's not really our theory, is it? It's based on a multitude of research, really.
Mine knows.
But it says, if your theory, or just theory, turns out to be true, brackets, and I think you are very probably right about the mistake over the timings, this is UTC versus BST, in the Baby E case, then it beggars belief that the police and the defence lawyers could have been so incompetent as to miss that. OMG, such a simple mistake. Another nail in the coffin of the prosecution case. Jesus Christ, this person has written an essay here. I'll try and go over this as quickly as I can. I have some reservations about the various theories regarding the alleged insulin poisonings. It is possible that there may be other nuances going on. My understanding of the method used to estimate the blood insulin levels is that the lab used you read that word.
Immunoassay.
Thank you. Was that right?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. I have seen it claimed that the lab used a technique called the Roche-Alexis sandwich method. Do you want to take this one? You go for it. There's a lot of fancy France words in this. I'm not going to do well with it.
I've seen it claimed that this lab uses a technique called the Roche-Alexis sandwich method. Too complicated to explain here. There's an outline description provided by Roche which explains this method. It basically works by measuring the amount of antibodies attached to the insulin in the blood sample. The antibodies are provided by the test reagents. They are not antibodies that were originally in the blood sample. There are things that can interfere with the test. Examples quoted by Roche would be biotin, which is vitamin B7, and also corrupted erythrocytes, i.e. damaged red blood cells. Also, apparently, it is possible that the test can cross-react to some extent. It should be noted that the C-peptide level would most likely also have been estimated via an immunoassay methods. Another interesting thing to be aware of is that apparently very premature infants, such as some of these, can have very different physiology to adults. That applies with insulin and C-peptide levels. It's noted in a number of references that I've come across that C-peptide may be excreted very rapidly in early neonates, much more rapidly than in adults. Perhaps it's an interesting line of thinking to reflect on why it should be that in adults C-peptide levels are, as a rule, so much higher. Apparently the adult physiology can actively control levels, whereas these babies just dump it out via the kidneys. Perhaps more research may be needed on this subject. So that's a lot of, obviously none of us are medical experts.
No, and I mean, I did my best to try and understand this. So when you're measuring in adults, you to test whether or not there's been exogenous insulin, i.e. injected or ingested insulin as opposed to naturally produced insulin, is this ratio, because when your body is producing insulin, it produces this chemical called C-peptide at the same time, and it's something to do with the way that C-peptide, I don't quite understand, but I think it's part of the process that you're producing the one at the same time. As you're producing insulin from precursor chemicals, the C-peptide's necessary for it somehow, beyond my knowledge. But there is just this assumption that these neonates are exactly the same as little adults, and it's just not true at all. Therefore, assuming that you can just say, oh, well, it should be exactly the same as an adult appears not to be true anyway. But also, these tests aren't that accurate. They have an error rate of 1 in 200. So you would expect to find some erroneous results. It's clear that the results at the time were just viewed as, lab errors. And both those babies survived and were fine. So from what that person who's obviously got a lot more medical knowledge than we do is saying, that it is clear that these tests are not directly testing for insulin, which is what we said.
And from the sound of the sort of the different physiology and the sort of different the way that babies process C-peptide differently from adults, it sounds like that the tests that were used may not actually be appropriate for neonates.
Yeah, I mean, they're only used...
Certainly the findings may not be as you would expect for an adult.
The point is that these tests aren't used to screen forensically for intentional poisoning by insulin. They're used as a clinical tool to test what the insulin levels of the babies are, to keep an eye on them. They're not a forensic test. They should not have been admitted into evidence.
Yeah,
the labs
are measuring so that you can develop a care plan to address whatever.
Precisely so. So, you're taking a reading and you're having a look at how things are going on, and most of the time they'll be good enough for that. But they're not good enough, but they're not proof.
Yeah.
So where you might get an erroneous result, you'd probably just run another test, usually if you needed to. If you did suspect poisoning, there's another test you can do, and they didn't do that. So they clearly didn't fucking suspect poisoning at the time.
There's a point here that mentions the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, but we've already
covered that.
I think a few more to go here. One says, excellent. This is probably the only podcast I would listen to for the full 2 hours. Oh. I know quite a bit of detail about certain aspects of the Lucy Letby case, but gained more clarity from your discussion on the topic. I think you're the first to bring up the timescale discrepancies with the Baby E case in audiovisual media. I know from experience it's not easy to explain. I've posted about this on Twitter/X over the last few months, and I'm 99.999% certain that the discrepancy exists and that the UTC-BST time difference is the best theory to explain the 1 hour time difference. Now, we haven't gone into great detail about this theory on this episode, but we do in the previous ones. If you want the backdrop of that, go and listen to that one. They go on to say, though, I did want to mention that it's not just the difference between the mother's and the hospital's call logs, it's also that her account of events contradicts agreed evidence in the form of the midwife's statement to the court. It also doesn't fit with the medical records from later in the night, which are incontrovertible. have also looked at the prosecutor's closing speech on this, and the way he distorted the timeline to suit his narrative is quite blatant. I'm sure he knew there were issues with it.
Yeah, I agree. So this is Japes Aloud on Twitter. I think their name is the same on YouTube. And they are one of the people who's been instrumental in spotting this. There's another chap as well, and I'm sorry I can't remember your name right now. But they've gone through all of the records and worked out that this is almost certainly what's occurred. And I think there's a very, very strong chance that they're right, because it's not just the one thing. There's a whole load of points that don't make sense, but if you just move that hour, they all line up as discussed there.
Yeah.
And the reason that the mum thought that she'd been there at 9 o'clock was that was the time she usually went to take a feed. But the time you usually do something is one of those things it's an incredibly common problem in criminal investigations, where people get accused, usually if they're actually the suspect, they'll get accused of changing their story, because they'll be asked, what did you do on X day? And they'll go, right, so that was a Tuesday. Well, I usually do XYZ. So I'll usually leave the house at X time, do this, do that, do the other. And then later on, they might go and check and go, actually, on that Tuesday, I had to go to such and such and do such and such. So that's not quite correct. Change their story.
On that exact point, the follow-up comment here is, I think the mother believed it was 9 p.m. because she took down breast milk for him on schedule. I think it's wrong, though. And that sort of ties into what you're just saying there, that because it's a routine, the assumption that nothing can change or interrupt the routine, when in actual fact it could be better.
And I know we all think that, but this is the day that this terrible thing happened, so I definitely remember. I hate to break it to you, but you just don't. I can remember very exactly where I was sitting when I took the phone call from my uncle telling me that my dad had died. I have no idea what time of day it was at all. It was February. It was dark. It could have been any point after 5 o'clock. I just don't know. Like the rest of the evening is a blur and a blank to me, as I then made arrangements to go home and do things and find somewhere to stay and find someone to take care of my kids and all the rest of it. And I did all this stuff, but I've got absolutely no clear recollection on what time of day it was at all that I took that phone call, even though it was news of my dad dying. Because actually the shock of the thing happening completely distorts your sense of what. Oh
yeah, absolutely right.
So you think you think you'll remember these things, but I'm sorry, you don't necessarily.
Okay, next one. Absolutely, my take on the Occam's razor position. Lots of people seem to like this way of thinking about simple solutions, but if the problem itself has complex layering or can be problematic. Also, as you say, Occam's razor assumes rationality in all solutions, but when the simplest solution is flawed, like the rota showing Letby's presence in all the murders, it clearly has assumptions that she must have killed them, and errors in the initial presentation, brackets rota did not show all the deaths or the doctors. Of course, the simple solution was Letby did it, but the truth lies in the complexity of how these babies were really treated and cared for in an unsuitable environment, which has been the basic conclusion from the very first episodes, is that's the bit we're not looking at. And finally, the odds of a dodgy insulin result likely higher in preterm babies, also higher in babies born from mums with family history of diabetes, brackets non-antibody interference, and mums treated with insulin in pregnancy, brackets mums antibodies cross placenta.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Okay.
Is there anything we want to say before we round this one off? Because I don't know if we're going to come back to this one the next time. We may be a wee while.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a great deal more, because I think so much has come out and it's been so undermined. So I think all I would like to say is that the people who are absolutely convinced that Lucy Letby is guilty seem incapable of processing the truth that there have been other miscarriages of justice. And there's this notion, but the police couldn't have done that, and the police wouldn't have done that, and this, that, and the other. The doctors wouldn't have done that. And the problem is that if you accept that miscarriages of justice can happen, then you should always bear in mind that even something that you're absolutely convinced of might in fact be a miscarriage of justice. You just never set that probability to zero.
Yeah. There are still people that think that Amanda Knox was guilty, even though the weight of evidence that she was not, and also she was eventually, she was released. But because they don't like her, because they don't like the way that she looks, they don't like the way that she talks, they don't like the way that she acts. But just because somebody acts in a strange way, or that their behaviour fits a sort of a narrative that's being constructed that you have accepted, that's not evidence.
No.
I have massive problems with the quality of forensic science in general. Even when it works, it's kind of a lot of the time more of an art than a science, and that's really not the way that it's presented to the public.
I so agree on this. There's this thing that even fingerprints, people think fingerprints are absolutely solid. Fingerprints are still judged by eye. I know we've all seen, like, on CSI and stuff, they put them into the big computer and all the rest of it. It's actually horseshit. It comes down to some guy eyeballing it or some woman eyeballing it. It's not, and fucking gun science is bollocks.
Yeah.
You know?
There's also, like, even DNA is not infallible. This is the problem, is that forensic science in general is not infallible. But in this case, forensic science was not the thing that put Lucy Letby behind bars. It seems to me that it was a misunderstanding of statistics. It was a misunderstanding from key people in this case of what their role was supposed to be. If you have a medical expert who is examining evidence under the assumption that there had to be foul play involved because the police were already investigating it, and the police took his testimony as a reason to continue to investigate it as a murder. If there was even what, because that we're not talking about a single baby who was murdered or a single baby who died, it can be easy to lose perspective a little bit when you're just talking about, you know, a bunch of different deaths. You start to sort of, like, you can sound a bit callous, I think, when you're talking about it because it's so abstracted.
Yeah.
If there was a single one of these babies, if in any of these instances there was evidence that you could look at and it didn't immediately crumble, if there was evidence, even if it wasn't hard evidence, if there was any evidence that suggested, oh yeah, she probably did that one, oh, fuck her then, fuck her, I don't care shit the rest of them, fuck her, put her in jail for the rest of her life. But the issue is that every single one of them, as soon as you look into it and you hear any of the other facts that just were not considered, it all falls apart. And that is where it's just, look, she might still have done it, but you'd have no evidence. And I feel really, really uncomfortable with the fact that this has just been so widely accepted by so many people.
Yeah. The thing that I think to be more even-handed about it, to actually look at the possibility that, well, maybe she is guilty, we've mentioned, like, the flight safety thing a couple of times. So when the plane crashes, we establish how and why that happened. And the next thing you do is, well, how can we avoid this happening again? The absence of discussion around, well, okay, she did it, but how are you going to stop that happening? The fact that you've managed to create an environment where it's possible to kill that many babies and kind of get away with it for that long, that shouldn't be happening. The fact there's not a discussion about why aren't there CCTV cameras, cameras. So many of the question marks around this could be solved if we had these catches in place. So the fact that we haven't even utilised this as a way of asking, how can we improve the NHS? How can we improve these environments for these babies? And instead, the focus has just been from the media on, let's do a spooky witch story about evil nurse. So even if you accept the guilty verdict, I still think there's massive feelings in how the media have conducted themselves with us, how the cops conducted themselves with it, how the court case ran out, and the fallout from it. Like, it doesn't feel, whichever way you slice it, this is really a positive. And I think that my feelings at the moment are leaning heavily towards, I think this is a miscarriage of justice. That's where I'm at the moment, but I'm still open to the idea that she could be guilty. But I still think that even if she is, that the fact that would have been able to happen is in itself a problem that we don't seem to want to address. The questions we've raising about the, shit in the sinks does not seem to have caught the public's attention in the way that I feel that it should. The standard of healthcare being provided is not where it should be. And of course, the ultimate irony being one of the individuals that tried to raise attention to those very issues was Lucy Letby herself.
Yeah. The reason that it hasn't caught on as much with the public is that it's not shocking.
Yeah.
It's a serial killer nurse who looks like she's a genius. She's got away with it for so long. She's this Machiavellian figure. That's shocking. That's something to really get your teeth into. That's something that will, spark the public imagination. NHS has shit in the sinks and is a poorly run ward. It doesn't spark imagination because it's just taken for granted that, of course, that piece of shit.
With the kids, it's brain rot. It's literally the fact that, the line of duty writers were like, oh, we could get an episode out of this, is more where their heads went. It's what you say, it's more narrative. It's more that, as opposed to maybe we should put a government in power that will actually look after our health service and avoid these situations. And I think that's the sort of tragedy of it. Then no matter which way you look at it, not guilty or guilty, the fact that has not been the immediate focus. Something must be done. But that's not up where our heads are at. The heads are, let's keep this spooky story going so we can keep gossiping about it for fucking years. So at least when we're doing this podcast, we are approaching it from the angle of miscarriage of justice. Most of the stuff that was on the prosecution end of it from the media has just been reveling in the nasty, spooky story. It's not going to the next level of maybe things have to change within the health service to prevent something like this happening. I've not read a single thing or heard a single person even come out and say anything along those lines. And that's where it would differentiate from a plane crash, where the entire investigation would be being conducted, but the intent of avoiding
another plane
this
crash
happening again.
Well, the problem is that you now have the Thirlwell Inquiry, who is tasked with working out how we stop something like this happening again. But their entire inquiry is, how do we stop another serial killer nurse? If there wasn't a serial killer nurse to begin with, and as is what I say, person after person gives evidence, and what you hear from the evidence is them saying, well, the reason I didn't call the police is because there wasn't any evidence that Lucy Letby had done anything wrong. And it's just the same thing over and over and over again. And despite itself, it's inadvertently revealing a truth, which is that there wasn't any evidence she was doing anything wrong. She was well liked, she was a good nurse, and the ward was a shit show.
You're right, because the analogy falls down because, of course, in a flight, your crash investigation,
the plane has actually crashed.
It has actually crashed, and you would have identified how it happened, and then you can work on the how do we prevent it. But here, there has not been a crash. So you're just chasing your tail. You're chasing nothing. You're chasing shadows.
There's no how and there's no why. There's only a who.
Yeah.
And the who never had a question mark after it. It was Lucy Letby from the very beginning, from the outset, from the time that before the consultants ever went to the police, it was Lucy Letby that was in the frame for it. And the fact that just never changed throughout the investigation, there was never even a question about it. And just even if she's guilty, there needs to be some serious questions asked about this, and there needs to I worry that because so many people now have stuck their necks out and have been so adamant that she is guilty, to the point where they retried her on the one death that they couldn't get her convicted on the first time. I worry that there's going to be delays in any kind of appeal. I know they're what is it, the ICCR?
The CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission. This brings us to another issue, which is the backlog at the CCRC. It was brought in after the sort of Birmingham and Guildford pub bombings were, the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6. After those verdicts were overturned, because so often people were just being refused appeals. And so the CCRC, was there to find out where there was an obvious miscarriage of justice and give people an opportunity to go back to appeal. But they've just got a huge backlog, and now they seem to have institutionalized themselves as just part of the denial process. So, I mean, a comparison, I brought this up last time, is the Andrew Malkinson case. Andrew Malkinson spent 17 years in jail for a rape he did not do. And it was realised very, very early on that there was DNA that did not belong to him and that did not belong to the victim's partner in what was described as a crime-specific place. So I believe it was on like the breast area of her t-shirt, and I think it was saliva. So it was obvious, and she'd been bitten. It's horrific, right? So it was obvious that this was the perpetrator, and it was not Andrew Malkinson's DNA. And the CCRC just kept not looking at the evidence. They refused him twice, and it was only after the Times ran a podcast called 17 Years on his case that the CCRC actually took it. And there isn't time for absolutely everybody who needs one to have a podcast. There aren't enough people doing investigative journalism. And by the way, that shouldn't actually need to be the fucking route, right? Although it seems to end up being the route that you have to get media scrutiny on a case.
We talked about this a lot on the Post Office Scandal episode, where you said it will take a drama series made by ITV. And I remember being quite annoyed about that and thinking it's highlighting how bad journalism is.
But the journalism
department are starting to do this.
No, but see, I take issue with this because I disagree. The journalism was there. The journalism had been done. There were some great journalists who had been covering this for years. It just wasn't getting onto the news. It wasn't on the nightly news, and it took the drama to put it on the nightly news. But the thing is, when you've got something as complicated as the Post Office or the Letby thing here, what you've got is a story that at the point that somebody first interacts with it, it may have been going on for months and years, and you need something that will enable them to see all the way across it and see it as a human thing. And a drama does that really, really well. And so actually, I have got no issues whatsoever with a drama being the thing that brings it to the
I don't
to
actually
public.
mean a drama. I think it's just that if you happen to have I don't know, for example, a 24-hour news channel, you could maybe fill that fucker up with some actual useful information once in a while,
We have to have the trans question again.
I know. Exactly. Let's just do, for the 5th time today, what's Joanne saying on Twitter? Yeah, could you do better than that, please?
These human rights. On one side we have a doctor, on the other side a Nazi. Discuss.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with all of that.
I'll concede though.
But the issue,
journalism should.
There's great journalism being done, but what we've so I believe that if you don't want to sound like a fruit bat, what you actually say is legacy media as opposed to mainstream media. So
man.
Legacy media news channels are, as you say, they've got hours and hours and hours to fill every day, and they're not filling it with investigative reporting because that's really expensive and time consuming. They're filling it with shit. And so they'll run the same story over and over and over. If you have the news on in the background, you start to notice that you're like, oh, right, I've already heard this segment. And then you go to Sky, oh, I've already heard this segment. Oh, I've already heard this segment, over and over and over. And yeah, it's all just full of pish, which is why I don't tend to bother watching any of that. I tend to watch Channel 4 News, and you get 50 minutes of pretty solid reporting most of the important things that'll be happening that are relevant in the world to some extent. But the real issue here is the CCRC. This is really, really broken. They need massively more resources to go in to be reviewing these, and we need a different mentality of person reviewing the cases. I mean, there's any number of cases that are screamingly obvious that there might be a miscarriage of justice. Jeremy Bamber is another one where he's been in prison for 40 years for killing his family. And I mean, if you don't know, this is a White House Farm case. This is really good, for instance. Initially, it was seen that it was his sister she had problems with psychosis. She was on medication. She'd taken a gun and shot her mum and her dad. And this was, and her kids, I think, as well, actually, sorry. And within a couple of weeks, the wider family were basically tittle-tattling to the police about Jeremy Bamber. So what happened was Jeremy Bamber got a call from his dad in the middle of the night saying that his sister had gone nuts and had fucking shot him. Jeremy tried calling his dad back, says the line was engaged, called the police, and he didn't call 999 because it's the early 80s. He phoned a local police station because he's out in the country, and, you know, he just phoned the local police station to get them there most quickly. He then drove there. He met the police at the farm. There was a sort of siege situation outside the farm for hours, during which time the police at the time reported that they'd been talking to whoever was inside the house. But this all got washed away, and it became that he had killed them, then cycled home, then phoned the police and set it all up. He's been in jail for 40 years. He's always maintained his innocence. There are two facts that should jump anything else. There's all sorts of things you can go backwards and forwards with on the case, but there's two things that should just put it right back to the CCRC. The first is the police saying that they were talking to somebody in the house while he's there with them. And secondly, subsequent to that, is that at 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a phone call came from inside the house to 999 while Jeremy Bamber had been standing outside with the police for several hours. There was another thing that came out, which was that there was a record of the dad phoning the police station as well before Jeremy Bamber had phoned. And the police say, oh, no, this was just we accidentally made two records of Jeremy Bamber calling. But you read the notes, it's pretty fucking clear that one is the dad calling saying his daughter's gone nuts with the gun, and the second one is Jeremy Bamber phoning saying my dad's just phoned me saying my sister's gone nuts with the gun. He's been in jail for 40 years. And it's like nobody wants to admit.
How does that happen? I know how it happens because we've just gone through it over the course of 3 podcasts, but how does that happen?
I was older, do you know, because he was good looking and he was quite full of himself and he didn't seem to be grieving enough. So it's back to demeanour evidence again.
Amanda
Knox all over again. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, and again, do you know what? Maybe he was throwing his voice. Maybe he sneaked into the house to make a phone call. Maybe all those things are true. Or maybe, just maybe, he's not the most likeable guy in the world, but he didn't in fact kill his mum and dad and his sister just to inherit some money. And maybe the fact that his conniving relatives then managed to get all of that inheritance because he's in jail and they're the ones that blamed him. Just saying.
The final thing I think just on the media presentation as well is because that's now becoming a recurring theme of who we're all talking about. Yeah, it's the media's presentation of normality is a huge factor in this because, of course, if you're actually in the real world, people are all different types, different characters, and just because they don't behave like they should in a drama, for example, the way you've been kind of conditioned to say, how do people deal with grief?
Oh,
you know, it's a bit of a side point, but an interesting thing about how ghosts are thought of, for example, is that throughout history, before we had like film medium, ghosts were talked about as being solid, but because of the advent of film, to signify that it's a ghost, that translucent thing, but that's not actually how ghosts would have been thought of. But now that is what it is. We've talked about a little bit of this with the UFO in the paranormal episode about stuff that gets picked up through kind of pop culture, of ways to talk about and things that become normalised that are works.
So something that was a media signifier becomes how we expect ghosts to look.
So things like grief and trauma is like a really good example of that, where it's in order to signify to the audience a character is upset. Well, of course, as the director, you're going to go, could you do a bit of crying here so we were clear about what's occurred? But that doesn't necessarily mean that is one for one to real life.
No, there's a lot of...
You're rocking it's a dramatization. So whether it's on stage or in film, it's not an exact one for one reality. And that's where the media, I think, sometimes they themselves are part of that slightly distorted reality. And if someone's not playing to the norms of that distorted reality, well, they must be a liar. But in a world of presentation and lies, you need to have a brain that can decipher
That's really interesting. I didn't know the ghost thing. That's really, really interesting.
I think in stage I think they were sort of painted grey. It's always been a way to sort of identify visually to the audience. This is it's shorthand. I think it probably also goes back to like silent film as well, where you could just have a character going, a ghost. You know, you have to have a clear visual indicator. But that's why like earlier ghost stories, they're displayed as different. We talked about this with the UFO stuff and aliens being like how you can sort of go back to like, you know, pixies and leprechauns, and you can see the DNA of this thing that's always been there, but as the medium and presentations change, the norm of that alters within the public's mind. But I just think that's worth keeping in mind, that emotions are exactly the same way. How an actor behaves is not how a real person behaves.
I hadn't thought about it in those terms because so when my papa, who was my favourite person in the whole world, till my papa died, I cry constantly. Cry all the time. Chris and I watched Fox and the Hound the other night. I bawled my fucking eyes out. It was so sad.
As if 11 o'clock at night and you cried so loud I thought you were going to wake the neighbours. It was a wailing. He doesn't understand.
He doesn't understand that she's letting him go because she loves him and she's going to be all... So I cry all the time. I'm not shy about crying. When my papa died, I didn't cry for 6 months. I just didn't cry about it. If there was any suspicion around my papa's death, which there obviously wasn't, and somebody was looking at me with any kind of scrutiny, they would be like, oh, that's strange that she's acting that way. But because that obviously wasn't the case, everyone was just like, you're processing this in a way, this is going to catch up to you, you're going to feel this at some point. And then after 6 months, I was like washing the dishes, listening to a random song, and then it hit tears. Yeah, and I couldn't stop crying for weeks after that. But that is, people deal with grief in very different ways. And when it's somebody that you know and somebody that you love, and there's a natural death, a tragedy has occurred, you are so generous with your opinion of them and your approach to how they deal with it. But when there's any kind of scrutiny placed, we all become armchair experts, we all become body language experts.
Yeah, it's like Jeremy Corbyn got a lot of this as well, because like Corbyn's quite an awkward... I think he's not really an awkward guy, it's just that he doesn't do the generic hand movements that all the politicians do. This presentation,
he is a grumpy bastard as well.
Yeah, but this is basically, it's the same concept of that's like a real person. So someone with my brain wiring's like, authenticity, so I'm like drawn to that. But it's what the media will do is put him in a Russian hat and go, look at this fucking oddball, when all you've actually got is somebody that's being quite genuine.
Has reacted naturally to a stupid fucking question.
The media, that's what they turn gun for with these kind of gotcha moments. It's like, all we need is to shove a microphone in your face or jump out at you and get you to react in a way that we can just take that 30-second clip and go, look how not normal this is. And that's enough to start the shunting process. But it's just to make people remember that what you're seeing through the television is not real. It's all feeding to a narrative, because that's, to come back to the Lucy Letby case, that's the thing. It started with a narrative. It started with a story. And that is part of the telling of that story. Yes, that she's odd. My dad said this morning in the call. She comes across quite strange. And I'm like, it elaborates, to use the Tucker special. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So the other thing is that by the time that trial happened, this had been going on for years, and there's a thread someone did on Twitter, and it just went through all of it. It was like, and so starting with you get your house and you've got your cats, and then you get arrested, and then then you're held on remand, and then the cats have to go back to the cat home, and every sort of few tweets and people keep asking you about dead babies and dead babies and dead babies, and the cats die and you're being asked about dead babies, and by the time you're on trial, you've there's nothing left. You're just a husk. You're wiped out.
Yeah, the process can be the punishment. Like, you don't actually need to find someone guilty to actually have dragged them through like hell and back. And even if you manage after decades to like prove your innocence, you're then faced with trying to make something of your life. Good luck trying to get any compensation.
Yeah,
like the post office
has still not had.
He's been living on a tent.
Yeah.
Um,
And then even if you do get your compensation, the lawyers are just going to hoover that right up. So good luck.
There's something that we don't like to admit to, is that in the institutions, not just of this country, probably of most countries, don't like to admit that they've made a mistake, and so will put walls in your way. I mean, the Birmingham Six, when they were getting there, when it was perfectly obvious, and the media was covering it and all the rest of it, one of the judges involved said it's so problematic for the reputation of the British justice system that it would be better for them to just stay in jail. It would have been better if we'd executed them, then we wouldn't have all this problem. Even though he knew that they were innocent.
It comes back to, again, the narrative thing, because like film and TV structured, you don't build things around a whoops. You build it around, there's a guilty, there's a good guy and there's a bad guy. Everything's rested.
I think probably, look, from their perspective, the thing that is holding society together is not these institutions, it's trust in these institutions is the thing that I would say is holding society together. I disagree with that. I think that, as a species, that we are prone towards pro-social behaviour and we would all get on fine. But I think that's probably it. Like, what is more important, like holding together the trust in these institutions, or one person going to jail when shouldn't have.
Whereas my view on this would be that if you want people to trust these institutions, maybe you should run them properly and sack people who are corrupt.
No, that's ridiculous.
I'll never catch on with it.
I think a lot of the time these institutions, like each individual person within it feels like they're just doing their job and they're being quite moral and upstanding about how they're going about things. But I think the institutions in themselves kind of take on a life of their own.
Yeah.
And even though the people within it are just kind of following processes, there's this kind of higher thing going on that corrupts people as a group.
Yes.